spent many years teaching, and I found out it was harder for students to hit a moving target, so move around. If you can hear me, that's good. If you can't, and I really need to, I will move over behind the podium. Can you hear me well enough all over?
Yes.
Okay. First off, again, since I spent many years teaching, every teacher has to have handouts. So I brought 2 handouts from my old teaching files. I've been going through my old teaching files and digging out stuff going, this was great. Wow, they must have loved this, and I don't know that they did, but I've got 2 things that really struck me, and they've got nothing to do with our topic tonight, but it may be something that interests you. One of them, and I'll pass them around, and there's plenty of copies, so you just grab a copy and go get them. One of them, if you read Parade magazine, you may be familiar with Marilyn Bosavet, who's probably got the highest IQ of anybody who's been recorded, written a column for years, and she wrote a column years ago in response to a letter from a first-year high school history teacher saying his students constantly asked him, why do we have to study history? And if you've ever talked history or taught history or talked it to anybody, that question always comes up sooner or later. Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to study history? We historians, it was algebra, chemistry, science, all that kind of stuff. But for most ordinary students. So anyway, she came with what I think is a brilliant answer befitting her brilliant IQ. So I kind of thought it was fun. So if you want to pass that around. Wherever they wind up back in the back, just collect any leftovers, and I'll appreciate it. The other one is written in 2001, which is practically prehistoric times in student years. Written in 2001, and it was an editorial. The title of the editorial, this is again back when we were just getting into Afghanistan, which 20 years later we've finally gotten out, for better or for worse. But the editorial, or it was an editorial written, quote, to the Afghans, a few of our favorite things. And the editorial was about if you really want to change Afghanistan and those people and their lives, you don't drop bombs on them and send guns and soldiers and whatever. Send them a few of our favorite things. And it lists some of the favorite things, including, if you remember, the Ken Burns Civil War thing. So send them a copy of Sullivan Ballew's letter. I don't know if you remember Sullivan Ballew's letter, but that's there. Part of the, just clips from movies, clips from this, Martin Luther King's speech, just stuff that this editorial argues represent America far better than guns and bullets and bombs and things like that. I thought it was interesting, and I used to challenge my students how many of these have you ever heard of, and most of them they hadn't heard of, and the rest of them they didn't care about. So, typical students. Okay, when Tommy called and asked me to speak to you all tonight, I said, this is great, I've got several topics, I can talk on this, I can talk on that. And he said, well, no, we can talk on Native Americans. And if I slip out and call them Indians, please bear with me. I don't mean it as an insulting or demeaning term. Speaking as someone who grew up for a lot of years using the term Indians, so if I slip up, please, I hope you don't take offense. But anyway, so he said, no, I need you to speak on Native Americans. And at the time, I had recently published an article on Quanah Parker in Wild West magazine. And so that was what I decided to focus on. But then I saw the article in the newspaper about you all recently dedicated the, what is it called? The Peace Circle.
Yes.
Then it pays tribute to American Indians and the American Indian Treaty, the Peace Circle. And that made me think, we'll get there, we'll get to Quanah, just be patient, we'll get there. But it made me think about something, and that is, we have 2 statues in the historic Fort Worth stockyards. 2 statues. Do you know what they are? Quanah Parker and Bill Pickett. Yep.
Oh.
Quanah Parker, obviously Native American. Bill Pickett was a black cowboy. Made himself a star in rodeo as a bulldogger. Mm-hmm. Neither Bill Pickett nor Quanah Parker was born in Fort Worth, or grew up in Fort Worth, or lived in Fort Worth, or died in Fort Worth. So why do we have statues to them in the Fort Worth historic stockyards? Feel free, students, to jump in here. Or not.
Somebody thought it's a good idea.
Ah,
Because
somebody
he
thought
missed
it.
the lip of the bulldog. I mean, when he was bulldog.
Yeah, Bill Pickett was famous as a bulldog with his own technique, which we don't need to get into right now. If you want to come ask either me or Tommy later. But you need two things to put up a statue. One is somebody has to take a very deep and abiding interest in the subject of that statue. And secondly, come on people, secondly, money. Somebody has to be willing to write a check to write the cost of putting up the statue. You don't have the abiding interest and you don't have the money, doesn't matter how famous a person is, you ain't gonna have a statue. We spent years trying to get a statue to Ripley Arnold put up in Fort Worth, and we stumbled into one problem, one issue, one thing after another. We finally got it, I was just on the periphery, but finally got it by approaching the Coors distributor people, family, and they wrote the check to do it. And don't even ask about the connection between the Coors beer distributorship people and the statue of Ripley Arnold, but it took that, finally. A lot of us wanted it, but couldn't write the check. We are still trying to get a statue. Fort Worth has no statue to General William Jenkins Worth. Fort Worth has no statue to General Edward Tarrant. And because of a recent change in sentiments, political feelings, the chances of getting a statue to General Edward Tarrant are pretty slim now because Tarrant was a slave owner. And it's even harder to get a statue put up to a slave owner. Ripley Arnold also had a slave, nobody knew about it, so we got him by. But it leads to a question, and we're getting there, but it leads to a question, which is, we're in the process of putting up new statues. You all just put up the peace circle. And don't hold up your hand, this is a rhetorical statement, but I doubt if there's a single Native American in the room. And Grapevine, maybe there is, and if there is, I don't mean to insult you, but I'm sure Grapevine is not predominantly Native American, but somebody spent a lot of money to put up these statues, and it had to be for a reason. And we're busy putting up statues, and we're equally busy tearing down statues. All those Confederate heroes that people our age grew up adoring and loving. When I used to go to Sunday school at Westbury Church of Christ in the 8th grade, we used to have cards we filled out for our attendance cards. I signed my card Robert E. Lee every Sunday. Have no idea why, I just got Robert E. Lee every Sunday. That's how I was recording the Sunday school books. But anyway, but we're busy tearing down statues and putting up statues, and you have to ask, even if you're not the one writing the checks, why? What is it about certain people that they're now no longer worthy? We'll get there, but there was in front of the Tarrant County Courthouse since 1953 a big granite marker. And the marker was dedicated to Confederate veterans and their descendants who fought in the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. And the marker, granite marker, one of 4 or 5 markers on the Tarrant County Courthouse lawn, was put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1953. And I used to do tours of the courthouse lawn, and I'd tell people, here you got 4 markers, run around and look at them, see which one is politically incorrect. And nobody got it. My young students, my older people, they all look good. One is to TCU, which that may be politically incorrect if Patterson keeps losing games. One is to TCU, one is to firefighters. And who could possibly protest a marker monument dedicated to firefighters? A third one is to MIAs. Missing in action, not just Vietnam, but our soldier MIAs. Nobody could protest that. And I showed them the statue dedicated to all these veterans who fought in wars. I said, what's wrong with that? This is veterans who fought in the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. What's wrong with that? And they're going, nothing, that sounds good to me. But it begins with Confederate veterans and their ancestors who fought in these other wars. And you get down to the bottom, it's put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. That marker is no longer there. About a year ago, there was a lot of protest, and the county commissioners decided to whisk it away, and they didn't exactly do it in the dark of night, but One day it was there, one day it was gone. And there for several months it was just a spot in the grass of dirt, and it's gone. And where it winds up now, nobody knows. It's officially in storage. Now, I'm not saying that to stir up your anger or your political feelings or get half of you to say good riddance and half of you to say the hell with them. I'm saying that because we need to look at why do we put up statues, memorials, monuments, and why do we tear them down? And what's the purpose? What's the point? And I think as a historical society, to just put up a statue or the peace circle to Native Americans, maybe it's something that the people of Grapevine might ask. Hopefully, if you ask, you engage in a civil conversation. We don't do that much anymore. If I'm right and you're wrong, I'm going to punch your lights out and call you a dirty name and kick you in the shins if you don't do it to me first. But maybe we could engage in a civil conversation. So all that is what came up to me as I was thinking about Quanah Parker. I'm talking about Quanah Parker, and I saw the newspaper story about the Peace Circle, and then I realized why Tommy was saying, no, Rick, the subject needs to be Native Americans. Something about Native Americans, and I finally understood it. So let's look at Quanah Parker. You came to hear Quanah Parker, and finally we're to Quanah Parker. The most photographed Native American in history, in American history. More than Geronimo, more than Sitting Bull, Quanah Parker, the most photographed Native American in history. Again, my favorite question, why? Why? Obviously, he wasn't camera shy. The man never met a camera he didn't like. And there's so many pictures out there. This particular article in Wild West Magazine, I set out with a friend who is much more connected to the Comanche Nation than I am, to try to date the pictures, to tell when this was taken. Because if you look at Quanah Parker pictures, there's a bunch of them, but you can only date them by looking at the setting or looking at how he aged and stuff like that. And in the case of Quanah Parker, Lordy, the man never met Botox and didn't need it, but he had those chiseled chiseled good looks right up to his last years. If you look at some of the Indian chiefs that were photographed late in life, they were stooped over, they were old, they were tired looking, and Quanah Parker would develop a little bit of a tummy in later pictures, but he always was erect and proud, and he always wore braids. He always wore his Indian braids. Now, what he did do, and I want you to look at it, we'll get to the pictures, but what he did do is he was a man of many faces, many appearances, in the fact that you had Quanah Parker, the Comanche Indian chief. And his role, his title as Comanche Indian chief was bestowed on him after the Comanche surrendered and went on the reservation. It was given to him by the U.S. government. In Comanche Indian culture, if you're not at war, you don't get a war chief. But the U.S. government said, you're Quanah, whatever your name is, you represent all the Comanche on the reservation, and that created some problems, some conflicts for Quanah. So that was one of the things that was a problem. Never met a camera. He was Comanche chief, at least proclaimed, and he was, the old-fashioned, incorrect term is half-blood. He was half white, and again, I'm getting us all politically incorrect, and I hope I don't offend you, but half Comanche or half Native American, because his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, was captured by the Comanche. And when the Comanche captured young girls, they tended to take them as wives. We don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but not necessarily wives where you stand before a preacher and say I do and put a ring on and all that kind of stuff. But you know, you belong, if you're captured, you belong to him. And she was the wife of a Comanche chief and gave birth to children. So Quanah Parker, just a fascinating person. Again, he aged remarkably well. That's what I was saying. He had his native Comanche chief guard. He paid several visits to Fort Worth. He was friends with cattlemen like Burt Burnett and W.T. Wagner. And the reason they were friends was because Quanah leased Comanche reservation property to them for their herds. So they liked him as long as they got really cheap grazing land from the Comanche Nation, which was granted by Quanah without consulting necessarily the other Indian leaders, and that created some problem. but something about it in Fort Worth. And he came for various events in Fort Worth. When he was here, they put him up in a hotel. He was in the back of the hotel because he was still an Indian. Even he's an Indian chief, and they needed his goodwill. But when he came, he wore his Comanche costume, and he looked very Indian, not cigar store, but very fierce Comanche Indian. Other times, he wore a business suit. And he could wear a business suit just as well as he could wear a Comanche garb. Depended. When he traveled by train to various places, when he went to Washington, D.C., he was dressed in white man's clothes, just like any other white man riding a train to go into Washington, D.C. So he could move back and forth. In fact, one of the things about Quanah that we've always said, those of us that are interested in him, is he had the ability to have a foot in both worlds, in both cultures. He could move and talk, and get along and make business deals with whites, but he could also move in the Comanche world. So with all that said, far more than you asked for, here is the opening of the article in Wild West magazine. Came out maybe in August anyway. But this was going to be the opening of the pictorial chronology of Quanah Parker. And let's move forward, number one, the next one.
Richard, this is just a quick question about
Yes.
what you said when you think of it. Did Cynthia Ann raise him? Did he learn English from her?
Hold that question. I'm going to try to answer that. A lot of what we know or think we know about Quanah and Cynthia Ann is a very, very little bit of facts and a lot of extrapolation, elaboration, whatever. We didn't know him until he was a full-grown man and a Comanche warrior, and he made very successful war on settlers in the U.S. cavalry for years. And when he finally came in willingly to the reservation, he never really talked about, I was raised this way. Indians didn't do that. You know how we tell everybody I was raised and then I went to the first grade and then my mother did this? They didn't do that. It didn't matter who your mother was. So we're not really sure. Somewhere along the way he learned to speak English. Somewhere along the way. And depending on which stories you read, some of the newspaper stories have him giving these most eloquent speeches. You're going to go, darn, man, the same guy wrote his speech who must have written Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It's brilliant, it's eloquent. And you get the feeling that maybe this is the newspaper reporter's translation of Quanah's maybe broken English. But again, that's guesswork. This picture right here, Cynthia Ann Parker was captured by the Comanche in 1836. She married Chief Peter Nakona. And I used to tell students and other people, it's not Peter Nakona like John Smith or whatever, that's his name, Peter Nakona. It's not, Peter is not his first name. Hi Peter, how you doing? She was married, or the wife of Peter Nakona. She gave birth to several children, 3 of whom we know about, and there may have been others. Quanah Parker was born in 1848, or 1850, or 1852, or maybe somewhere in between. Because there were no records, no hospital records, no birth records, no census records. He was just born. And when Cynthia Ann was captured in 1861 by a group of Texas militia and settlers who captured and brought her back to Birdville. This is a picture. You've seen pictures of her. I submit you've never seen this actually. This is a daguerreotype. Before there were photographs, there were daguerreotypes. It's a more primitive, older form, but this is what she looked like. She wasn't a beauty by our Hollywood standards of what an Indian lass should look like, but this is a woman who lived like a Comanche Indian, and she chewed leather because that's how you soften the leather. She did all the farming and tilling the soil, which is what the women did in the Comanche tribe. And she lived as a Comanche woman, so she's not going to look like somebody who just stepped out of Central Casting. But what's interesting about this is her signature at the bottom on this daguerreotype. And there's 2 pictures of her that were taken in 1861 when she came back through Fort Worth and Birdville and went to live with her uncle on her uncle's farm. There are 2 of them, and one of them shows her nursing a baby. And that one has occasionally been Bablerized or whatever, because you can't have a woman nursing a baby in a photograph for crying out loud. Have you no culture? Have you no class? But the other thing I want you to see about her, if you've got really good eyes, Look at those hands. Look at the size of those hands. The woman could have played basketball and called it basketball. And I don't mean that irreverently. I just mean one of the things that stands out about Cynthia Ann is the size of her hands. That always struck me. But this is Cynthia Ann, and she was Quanah's mother. And when she was captured, Quanah wasn't captured, and he went on to lead the resistance to the U.S. Army, to the settlers, until he finally surrendered in 1875. Next picture. This is a picture of a very young Quanah, which I have dated. My friend and I, Clara Ruddle, who's personally much better connected to the Comanche Nation. I just brought the historical interest, and she brought the pictures, and we sat down and talked about them. But this is a picture I've dated about 1875, which is when Quanah surrendered. Here he's still wearing his traditional Indian garb. He's very young, although some sources date this picture as 1869. I think it's after he surrendered in 1875. Well, look at that man. It's a very proud man. His eyes aren't downcast. He doesn't look ashamed. He doesn't look like he's doesn't look defeated. Doesn't look ashamed. So I think about 1875, Quanah, but dressed in combination of Indian garb and white man's garb. Next picture. This one is in debate. I've had people tell me that there's no way in the world this is Quanah Parker, and Clara Ruddle and I decided we think it is Quanah Parker. It's hard to tell, but I think it is. If so, notice again, you can't see it as well from back there. If you get up close and magnify it, he's got his braids. He's got those cheekbones. He's got a rifle. But notice the horse has a Western saddle, a white man's saddle. And I think this would have been taken after he surrendered, because when he was running wild as a Comanche, leading his Comanche warriors against the U.S. Army and the settler, he didn't ride a Western saddle. But here's the horse that does. So I figure somewhere in 1875, 1876, whatever. But again, I've showed this picture to people who bow, swear up and down, they're adamant, this is not Quanah, it can't be. I think so, but open the discussion. Next picture. This is the picture, not your eyes. Your eyes aren't going bad. It's just kind of a blur. Some of the pictures we got were better. This is Quanah, 1885, and his father-in-law, Yellow Bear. They're posing in a Fort Worth studio. The Fort Worth studio of Auguste Mignon, M-I-G-N-O-N. This is their 1885 visit to Fort Worth. Yellow Bear is, I think Quanah's the one standing up upper left. Yellow Bear, I think, is in the middle, I think. Yellow Bear was the story, Yellow Bear and Quanah came to Fort Worth. Again, the cattlemen welcomed him. They put him up in the Pickwick Hotel downtown, although they stuck him way back in the back, but they put him up in the hotel. That's a famous story you may have heard about while they were there. Quanah went out for an evening on the town, and Yellow Bear went to bed. And Yellow Bear turned off the light, but didn't turn off the gas, and later when Quanah came back in, and stretched out on the floor, the gas kept going all night, and the next afternoon when they finally went to see what happened to our Indians and opened the door, Yellow Bear was dead and Quanah was half dead. And imagine how that would have gone over in Comanche land up in Oklahoma if Fort Worth had killed Quanah Parker and Yellow Bear. So we doctored him up and sent him home, and he forgave us, and he came back in the future. Yellow Bear was one of about 7 or 8 father-in-laws that Quanah had. Quanah had 7 or 8 different wives, which again is, besides the fact that he never looked older, he never sagged, he never whatever. Any man who could keep 7 or 8 wives happy or whatever is an amazing man. The U.S. government told him he couldn't have 7 or 8 wives, and that's you say 7 or 8. How many were they? Well, some say 7, some say 8. We've got the names of 7. There may have been an 8th. I can't even give you all the names. Clara could. But the U.S. government told him you can't have 7 or 8 wives. And Quanah said, okay. So from then on, he traveled with one wife. and he left the others at home. And the wife he usually traveled with was Tanarsi, and you'll see her later on. So Yellow Bear is his father-in-law, and it's nice he took his father-in-law with him, but he had about 6 or 7 other father-in-laws he could also have brought with him. But again, a photograph taken in Fort Worth, 1885, and obviously before they checked in the hotel, and Yellow Bear went to bed that night and didn't wake up the next morning because he's here in this particular picture. And the last thing to think about, and I asked this question, is okay, Quanah and Yellow Bear arrive in Fort Worth, right? And it's nighttime, and Yellow Bear says, I'm going to bed, and Quanah says, I'm going to go out into town. What does a Comanche chief do in the town of Fort Worth? He didn't go to the museum, he didn't go to a movie. I've got a book back there on Hellsouth Acre. They welcome anybody in Hellsouth Acre. And I don't mean that as an insult to Quanah. I just mean the only color they knew in Hellsouth Acre was green, muddy. So maybe he went down there, but we don't know. Move on. This is what we think is an 1889 picture of Quanah posed with a group of lawmen in Paris, Texas. And again, notice that's Quanah up in the upper right-hand corner. If you've got good eyes or you're close enough, can you see what he's holding? Holding a 6-shooter. So it's just interesting. Doesn't that make you wonder, why is Quanah Parker, Comanche chief, retired, posing with a group of lawmen, all of whom are outfitted, armed to the teeth, and he's right there with them. See the braids? Can you see the braids? But he's got a 6-gun in his hand. Did they take him along? Did he sneak in the picture when they weren't looking? I have no idea. He's a very young Quanah Parker, but then they look kind of like Wyatt Earp a little bit back. It's not. But Lord, he wouldn't have agreed if it was. But just again, a bunch of lawmen, and you can see badges on some of them if you're close enough. He doesn't have a badge on, but he's posed with them, and I think that's just fascinating. Move on, move on. This is Quanah the businessman and Quanah the traditional guard of Native America. I think about 1890, And so if you want to be figuring, best guess on Quanah, if you say 1850, for birthday, you're close enough for government work. And so count forward from 1850, and this is about 1890. The way people aged back then, before you had all the creams and lotions and air conditioning, all that kind of stuff, for a man in his 40s, especially who spent the time riding the open range and living like a Comanche Native American, God looks darn good. He looks darn good. Anyway, this was taken in a studio, the F.W. Hamilton studio in Oklahoma City. It's a cabinet card over here. A Hamilton studio, a cabinet card. What else? It was reproduced later by William Lenny and William Sawyers for a series they did on Indian views. And they took as many pictures as they could of as many Indians they could get inside the studio for several years. And those cabinet cards, that's a cabinet card, are one of the best collections we have of Native Americans photographed contemporaneously. And one of the problems was, unlike Quanah, many Native Americans wouldn't go near a camera or a studio. Quanah, like I said, never met a camera he didn't like. But look at him over there. Not only is he posed, look at, he's got his braids on, but look at the hat, got a nice derby hat on, got a nice suit. Can you see what's in his right hand?
An umbrella.
It's an umbrella. Is this not a distinguished gentleman? This ain't some half-wild Comanche. This is a distinguished gentleman. He's got on a hat, a derby hat, and an umbrella. I don't know if the umbrella was just a prop or actually used it, but it's an umbrella. And look at this. About the same time, two different Quanahs. Move on to the next one. This one is about 1890 also, a photograph labeled Chief Quanah and his men. Quanah is the one on the left. And again, look at this for curiosity. Maybe I'm just dreaming it up, but Quanah has very large hands, I think. Larger than a lot of us, the kind of hands that basketball players wish they had. And I always wondered, I told Claire I wondered, there's no way to back it up, if this was something he inherited obviously from his mother. Remember how large her hands were? And maybe that's a sign, a visible symbol of that mother-son relationship. or maybe a lot of horse feathers. I may just be making stuff up. But this is Quanah on the left with two Comanche medicine men, Quasiya, I'm sure I'm butchering that, and Frank Moita, who's standing. Quanah in traditional garb, except the fact that he's wearing a military officer's sash over his left knee. You can't see it unless you're up close, and why would he have a military, U.S. Army military officer's sash over his left knee? I have no idea. He does have a scalp knot, which is barely visible in the back if you're up close enough. And again, it's one of many, many studio photographs taken of Quanah. In this case, top two of his medicine men, as they were called by whites, into sitting with him. Move on. This is Quanah, about 1891, posed in front of the teepee where he lived. Even if he came in the reservation, he settled down and lived in a teepee until building Star House in 1890. The Star House was a large, white man's, almost a mansion, but a very large, nice house that he built in, how do you pronounce it, Cache, C-A-C-H-E, Cache, Oklahoma. It's still there. Sadly, it's falling apart. Oklahoma has not quite gotten up the whatever to preserve this house. It needs to be preserved. It was called Star House because there was a big, giant star on the roof. What the star stood for, why he wanted it, I have no idea. But the house is barely being held together because they just haven't invested the money to try to save it. But he kept the teepee up even after he moved in the Star House. And he did publicity shots in front of the teepee. Look what he's got in his hand. Bow and arrow. He didn't hunt or fight with bow and arrows anymore. It's a publicity shot. This is Quanah, the Comanche chief, posed in the Comanche headdress in front of a teepee, wearing traditional clothes with a bow and arrow. This is posed for publicity. This is not the way he fought the U.S. Army and others. He carried a rifle and didn't wear a headdress when he was galloping around. Move on to the next one. This is Quanah. I love this picture. You got all these pictures. You got to get up close, and again, the quality of the photograph, maybe wasn't the best when it was taken, and also it has faded as age and ill treatment have affected it over the years. But this is Quanah seated in his bedroom at Star House. In his bedroom at Star House. I don't know how good your eyes are. See that portrait by his left shoulder? Can you see what that is?
Cynthia.
That's his mother and sister, Prairie Flower, I think was the name, translated name, Prairie Flower. And this is the photograph that shows her nursing Prairie Flower. And I just think that's interesting. And he's posed there with her. And notice who's in the background over his right shoulder. Jesus Christ. Does this man know how to play the audience? Jesus Christ over here, your mom over here. The man was brilliant in a lot of ways. Anyway, here he's posed in his home at Star House. Next picture. This was taken in March of 1894 at the Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Quanah was visiting with two of his wives, Tanarsi and Nada. And they were part of a Comanche and Kiowa delegation which went to the school. Where's my note to myself? Which went to the school. To talk to the students there. Carlisle, most of us never heard of the Indian School of Carlisle until we saw the movie about Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe went to the Carlisle School, and others went. It was the only places in Native American Indian you could go to get a higher education. The first place, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And while with Quanah and two of his wives, and I'm not sure which wife is which, one of them is sitting over there on his shoulder, one of them is down to his knees. Notice they're all dressed how? White man's garb. All of them dressed in white man's garb. Why? Because Carlisle School was dedicated to transforming Indians into white people. Maybe you can't change your color scheme, but you change your culture. And so if you were a student in Carlisle, you never wore Indian garb. And if the Kiowa Comanche delegation is going to visit the Indians, they would be expected also to dress that way. So there's Quanah with two of his wives. Move on to the next picture.
I thought I would.
Or maybe not.
Right.
Hit next, hit next. Now,
Yeah, can you click next?
click on next.
Top one.
There you go.
Click it.
Click on that, see what happens. Is there a doctor in the house? All right, thank you. Yay, we'll go far. This is Quanah and what are referred to in the description as his fellow committee men of the Comanche Nation. They're standing in a wagon for some unknown reason. It was taken at Fort.
Escape.
I didn't do anything.
Okay, if you guys want me to shut up and sit down, just say something. All right. Quick. Okay, thanks. Watch where that man goes. Can we go back to this one right here? Don't touch anything, this one. Quanah and his committee men, as they were called, of the Comanche Nation, standing on a wagon in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I think it was taken about 1895. But notice the group dynamic. Look at the group dynamic. Who's standing in the front of the wagon? That's Quanah. Who's the head man? Who's the big honcho? Who's the big potato? Who's the big guy? The rest of them are maybe standing or sitting, but they're all behind it. The man in the driver's seat literally is Quanah Carter. Now, what they were committee men of, what they were doing, picture doesn't say, just a picture. Move on to the next one.
No smiles.
Oh, no. So the Indians never, actually nobody used to smile when they took pictures. I don't mean that as a, nobody smiles, partly because it took time to take a picture, and partly because a lot of people had bad teeth. And if it takes time to get a picture, get it all set up, you sit there going, or if you had bad teeth. So nobody smiled in the old pictures, and Indians even less so. I think we missed, can you go back to?
That is the one.
Yeah.
That's correct. Go back
Go
again.
back.
That's where you want to be. That's the next one.
Okay, yeah, now go forward one, this one. Okay, good. This is Quanah and Tanarsi as part of an Indian delegation to Washington, D.C. 1897, Quanah is at the far left. Tanarsi is sitting down beside him, at his left shoulder. That's Tanarsi, who some say was his favorite wife. She traveled the most with him, but you don't have any favorite wives anymore than you have favorite children if you're smart, I don't think. Anyway, it's a candid photograph with what fascinates me is that very large, unidentified white woman back in the background. Now, this is taken in Washington, D.C. You've got the Indians in the front, Native Americans, Comanche and Kiowa. You've got all these white guys in suits in the back. You've got a very large woman looking very stern in the back. Who was she? How'd she get in the picture? Was she somebody's wife? Did she stumble in the picture by accident? Was she related to the photographer? No idea. Move on to the next one. This is Quanah relaxing in his office at Star House. He's not old, but he's not young either. You can't tell much because of the quality of the picture. We dated it about 1897 to 1900. You can date the picture most accurately by the chromolithograph on the wall behind him. And the chromolithograph, which this is a blow-up of another image of it, another view of it, was a picture, Custer's Last Fight, by Otto F. Becker. It was produced by the Anheuser-Busch Company and given out along with beer starting in 1896. So the chromolithograph, which is another fancy word for a large poster, wasn't produced until 1896. So Quanah didn't have the picture then on his wall. But think about that. The title of the picture is Custer's Last Fight. It's on Quanah's wall. Does that guy not have an ironic sense of humor? I mean, just think about that. Think about what he was thinking when he put that up. He looks very relaxed. His office looks almost as bad as my office. But this was his office at Star House. Move on to the next one. Okay. In 1905, March of 1905, Quanah and some other Native American chiefs went to Washington, D.C. for Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration. It was Roosevelt that insisted they be there. And this group of men on horseback on the right is Quanah and some other chiefs who are identified. Quanah is, well, let me see, I'm not sure. I think Quanah is the one in the middle on the white horse, I think. I haven't looked at this in a while. I have no idea who the others were, but this is at the same time he was in Washington. He's taken in this full Indian headdress. And again, there's a debate over whether this is really Quanah, but Lordy, look at the headdress. Look at the headdress. I think it was taken at the same time by the same photographer in the same studio. Why? Just because I think so. Claire and I think so. But it's certainly dramatic looking. And of course, then there's those that say, that doesn't look like Quanah, I don't think it is. You have to decide. Next picture. This is Quanah Parker's star of stage, screen, and battlefield, 1907. He was one of the stars of a genuine film, a movie, outlaw lawman movie with such celebrities as Al Jennings, Bill Tillman, Frank Canton, and Het Thomas. It was a silent western. 1908, The Bank Robbery, released in 1908. And that's Quanah on the white horse in the front. I don't know that a full copy of the movie exists. Again, it's a 1908 film. But I do think it's interesting that Quanah managed to get into the film and it's front and center in this shot right here, 1908. And since it's a bank robbery picture, you've got the bank there behind him in the picture. Move on, next picture.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, by all means.
How did the other wives feel about Cynthia?
John, good question. Again, he didn't interview Native Americans' wives and ask them how they felt about anything. They were in the background. And so I'm not sure that they would have had an opinion or been allowed to have an opinion. They never met Cynthia Ann. Cynthia Ann eventually died. When I was growing up, we said she died of a broken heart, but she just didn't take to white civilization again. And when she was being whiteified and trying to transfer back into a white woman, 1836 to 1861, how many years is that? That's how many years she lived as a Comanche. She was about 12 years old. So she was at, I'm answering your question in a rambling way. But so while she was doing all that, he was on the warpath, fighting. So they never got together and she died. Now later on, he spoke of her often. He arranged eventually to have her body moved up to Oklahoma and requested when he died and to be buried beside him. But your question, how did the wives feel? There's no record anybody ever asked. And I think that both the wife and Quanah would have taken tremendous exception to being questioned about something like that. This is Quanah's wife, Quanah's mother, and he always spoke of her reverently. And what wife is going to say, I have a mother with a stupid white woman? It's just, you got to kind of figure that they wouldn't say anything negative. This is about 1909, Quanah Parker, the family man. He's posed with Tanarsi. Again, that's Tanarsi beside him, who I think was his favorite wife. She simply traveled with him more than anybody else. But on the front porch of Star House. And over there to the side, the other picture is 5 of Quanah's children, which he had. Not every one of his wives bore children. At least 3 or 4 of his wives we know bore children. These are 5 of those children by various wives, which didn't bother anybody except the white government and the white preachers. It didn't seem to bother the Native American many. But I want you to look at there. I want you to think about it though. This is a man, a Comanche chief, a man's man, if you will, a traditional patriarchal male-dominant culture, but he's standing on the front porch of his house, beside who? His wife. Think about that. Think about that. This is a man who obviously wasn't threatened by getting photographed with his wife. And most of you are thinking, well, my husband wouldn't be threatened, would you, honey? Or I would never be threatened by posing with my wife. but you weren't a Comanche Indian raised in a different culture, but just look at it and think about it. She looks right at the mirror, actually. I mean, she's not standing there like that, but you can tell who the big dog is, who the chief is, and that's Quanah. But his children over there, who were their mothers, he knew, but that hasn't come down to us. Move on to the next one. Move on to the next one. This is, I love this picture. This is a young Quanah with another one of his wives. Not sure which wife this was. This is not Tanarsi. If you went back and forth between these last two, you can see this is not Tanarsi. This is a very good-looking woman. But look at her face. Look at the expression on her face. Is she not shy or reluctant to be there? This is not her idea of a fun time. The man who looks casual, got his gun there and just reared back, looking as big as life, is Quanah. He's got this wife beside him who, to me, looks like she'd rather be any place else in the world besides posing for the camera. But you got also, I have to admit, I think he's a good-looking woman by any standard, white, Native American, whatever. But then I don't know how Comanche judge good-looking. I think they're more practical. But got his weapon. Quanah never posed, or seldom posed in Indian garb without a weapon. Either because it was natural or because it was part of the act, part of the publicity. Next picture, we're getting there. This is Quanah posed with Tom Burnett. And Tom Burnett was the son of cattle baron Burt Burnett, who has all sorts of stuff named after him in Fort Worth, foundations, buildings, streets, everything. This is Tom Burnett, the son that Burt Burnett eventually denied and didn't particularly like him, wasn't close to him. And Tom Burnett ran part of the ranch up in North Texas, up in the Panhandle. There's a point to this story because I want you to look at Tom Burnett. Tom Burnett struck up a relationship with the Comanche Indian woman across the river in the reservation, and he would visit her and visit her fairly often. And I got some letters that were in a legal suit that showed one time he visited her and bestowed upon her very own tent. Her very own tent. So I guess they had a place to stay when he visited. Think about that. But eventually, the reason I bring that down is eventually their offspring, a daughter they had years later, wound up suing the Burnett family. Tom Burnett died in 1935, and this offspring of Tom Burnett and his Indian, whatever you want to call her, wasn't his wife, concubine, mistress, whatever, wound up living in Washington State and sued the family. There's a point to this story. Those documents wound up in a legal brief, which for some reason wound up at the Fort Worth Library by mistake, because law firms don't put their legal papers for a case on public display in the library. And I discovered it years and years and years ago and wrote the story about Tom Burnett. The point of the story being that she sued the Burnett family. Now, Tom was dead. Burt Burnett was dead. He had died. But Ann Burnett was alive and had every lawyer in the world on her side. And the Burnett lawyers ripped the daughter to shreds. They got her in the stand. They brought in all these other Indians to say she was a whore and she slept with anybody and whatever, just like her mother, and blah, 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 blah. And Tom Burnett, they didn't know who Tom Burnett, and they just ripped it. She had one poor little lawyer who was her lawyer, and she lost very, very badly. And the last part of the story being, if you're wondering why I don't move along, is because I wrote this story up based on these legal papers and submitted it to Wild West magazine. And Wild West planned to publish it. And then I made the mistake of sending a complimentary copy to the Burnett family in the Burnett building downtown, thinking that they would appreciate an advance copy. And their lawyers, if you know the name D. Kelly, their lawyers contacted Wild West magazine and threatened in very crude language what they were going to do to the editor and publisher at Wild West if they dared publish this. And Wild West threw up their skirt and said, "We surrender and we'll edit out anything you want to edit out." And so it wound up edited way, way down. But it did get published. It edited way, way down. And the end of the story, D. Kelly eventually called me and said they wanted to know, the Burnett family wanted to know where the hell these papers came from. And I said, you know, if you'll ask Ann, Burnett, whatever, if you'll ask her to call me and ask me, I'll be glad to show her where they are, take her to them, put them in her hands or whatever. But this threatening stuff, this making threats and calling me names and telling them, I won't even tell you the language. When you want a lawyer, you want a junkyard dog lawyer. And Dee Kelly was an outstanding lawyer for the family. I said, when you threaten me and the publisher and all this kind of stuff, I'm not going to give you all squat. But if she'll call and ask, and he laughs, and yeah, okay, hung up. So that's Tom Burnett, the source of all this trouble later that came up with illegitimate children and lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. Standing beside Quanah Parker, which has to be amazingly ironic. Move on to the next one. Move on to the next one. Quanah's image and name were well enough known that he was very useful for publicity, for advertising. His classic features, promotional purposes, in this case the Quanah route, a Texas short-line railroad, 1910 Hardeman, the Quanah route day was a way of promoting it. And I submit to you, there was not a single other Native American chief that you ever heard of, anybody ever heard of, who loaned their name, their picture, their image to promoting railroads across the West. But Quanah did. Quanah was a sharp fellow. Anyway, we'll leave that and move on. There's a story behind that, but we'll move on because of time. This is Quanah, an older Quanah, I think about 1910, posed on the Matador Ranch. It's a very rare, candid photograph. He's not dressed up in a warrior garb. A lot of it, he's got his thumbs hooked in his pants. He's got a little bit of a tummy. You see, he's got a little bit of a tummy. Look at his face, though. Look at his face. I mean, he doesn't look like a tired old man. I just add up the years and then figure how he lived his life. But this is, like I said, a candid photo. His thumbs casually hooked, but still proud and still erect and still with the same braids. Move on to the next one. This is about 1910, a little later, I think 1910. This is an elderly weather-beaten Quanah not long before his death. He's about 65 or 66 years old here, but still very recognizable as a fierce warrior chief who once terrorized white Texans. This was taken in the Wright Photography Studio in Lawton, Oklahoma. He died February 23rd, 1911 at Star House. This was taken only a few months before his death, but even so, look, the braids, the cheekbones, he's still got all his hair, which puts him way ahead of me, and a lot of us. Is proud, erect, and looking right at the camera, as fierce as he was 30 or 40 years before when he used to terrorize white settlers. Move on, last one.
What was the jewelry?
Yeah, that necklace, that was around
Can you go back? That
the pin or whatever.
the sunburst pin here was something that shows up in a lot of his pictures. Clara, as my sidekick partner, whatever, knows a lot more about the pin. The story of that sunburst pin came down from the family. I'm not sure where he got it or when he began wearing it, but if you look at a lot of his photographs up close, the ones where he's dressed, especially in the businessman suit, he's got that wearing it. So it must have been something to him. But your question of where did it come from, why did he wear it? No idea, no idea. But again, the family, Clara is in contact with the family. And they tell her stories which are basically unprovable, but they've come down through the family, because you give somebody 5, 6, 8, 10 children, and then they have children, and they have children. There's a lot of Parkers left around. Move on, move on. This is the last one, you'll be glad to know. This is wives Tope, who is on the left, and Tanarsi on the right, and they are posed at Quanah's first grave site, where he's first buried, Post Oak Indian Missionary Cemetery, Indiana, Oklahoma. The headstone has his birth date as 1852. I'm not sure, there's really no way to prove that. Somebody told the people that made the headstone it was 1852, and that went on the headstone. But this is not the final resting place of Quanah. Eventually, when the Air Force puts in a runway and a base and takes up some of this land where a lot of these people were buried, Quanah had to be moved. He wound up buried beside his mother because he moved his mother from where she was buried in East Texas. He moved her to Oklahoma. After he was moved, he wound up beside her, and they are beside each other now. But it took years to get there, and it took the U.S. Air Force putting in a runway and I forget whichever base is near Lawton, Oklahoma.
Tinker, isn't it?
Which is
Is it Tinker?
maybe Tinker, I'm not sure, but whichever one is there.
It's
Fort
Fort
Sill?
Sill, it's an
Is it Fort Sill? My mistake, Fort Sill. But when the Army wanted land, they don't ask whether Indians buried here or not back then, not back in the 1950s. And when he was moved was the 1950s. And obviously, we have a different standard now. Yeah.
Is that his wife, one of them?
This is both of them. I mean, this is two of them. This is Tope. Tope on the left, Canarsie on the right. Tope on the left, Canarsie on the right. Again, the stories, each one had her own story. That lawsuit I told you about, and I'll quit here, and if you have questions or whatever, but that lawsuit I told you about, one of the neat things about the lawsuit is the law firm, Canty Hanger was the law firm of the Burnett family. And the law firm put together a whole file. You know, law firms, when you're in a lawsuit thing, you gather all the material you can. Never can tell what you need to destroy the other side. But they gathered the names of all his direct relatives that they could identify. And when Claire was looking at this, she was saying, I remember the family talking about this one. But there's this whole list of Comanche names of people that what they did is they interviewed various people and saying, who are his wives, who are his children, you name them. And that's the only list I've ever seen of his family, his direct descendants, his wife and children. And again, it was gathered, though, by Canty Hanger Law Firm, not out of historical interest, but so they could use the information against this woman that was suing the Burnett family. And Canty Hanger still exists, and D. Kelly's son is still a lawyer, and if you need a junkyard dog lawyer to defend you, by God, I think that law firm could still do the job. This is the end. If you've got a question, I'll be glad to answer them. If not, I will turn it back over to whoever's in charge. Yes, ma'am.
What did he die from? He looked pretty healthy. And he wasn't.
To say old age sounds sarcastic. I'm not sure what he died of. There were so many illnesses back in the old days that could take somebody away without a fancy name. If you're wondering, was it cancer, was it heart failure, was it a brain tumor? I don't know.
You don't know, okay, I just thought maybe you might know.
Are you aware that his great-great-grandson lives in Burleson, Lance Tomcara?
Lance Tomcara, yeah. And Lance, and then Lance's father, the family. And I don't know Lance personally, but a few years ago, when the interest renewed, Lance Tomcara and his father too, I think was alive, became rock stars. Because here was this Native American person, and the local Comanche in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the local Comanche tribal group really took off 2 years ago. He was kind of the acknowledged leader. I don't know him personally, but I knew he lived in the area.
I do know him.
You do know, when they did, we'll get there. When they dedicated the Ripley Arnold statue in 2012, down there behind what's now Tarrant County Trinity River campus, when they dedicated the statue, they had Comanche Indians come in and bless the soil, bless the ground. And now, didn't that strike you as odd? Because Ripley Arnold was here to keep the Indians at bay, not to defend and protect them, whatever. He was an Indian fighter, really in basic terms, and yet the city and county invited in the Comanche to bless the soil around where the monument was put. I just found that tremendously ironic. Not everybody has their opinion, but I thought it was ironic. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When I was in the 7th grade, there was a girl named Sandy Parker who was related to him that was in my class. I don't know anything about her, but you never mentioned about the Paladura situation with him.
The Paladura Canyon, you mean the fights he had, the two battles?
Do you have anything else?
The Adobe Walls battle, Adobe Walls 1 and 2?
No.
Or Paladura Canyon, you mean as far as, what was his name that owned the land?
Adobe Walls was Buffalo Hunters. Battle in Paladura Canyon is when Mackenzie snuck in there and jumped them. Got all their horses and shot them.
And I didn't say anything about it because without doing my homework, I don't know anything about it really to be able to say. There's some books published on several recent biographies, and it talks about one of them that I've taken issue with the author, says that Quanah was never defeated. That's not true. Adobe Walls was a defeat. The Comanche wound up retreating. And the author no longer speaks to me because I wrote him and said, but what about Adobe Walls? But Quanah has become an iconic figure. It represents all that is noble and wonderful about Native Americans, and that's why he has a statue in the stockyard. And please understand, I'm not tearing him down, I'm not saying he wasn't a wonderful chief, but we grab onto somebody like this and we elevate them because we need somebody that we as the majority can admire and respect and hold up as heroic, as iconic. And Quanah Parker fits that. A man, quite often he's been a man of the foot in two worlds, in two civilizations, and he was definitely that. So please don't walk out of here thinking that Selcer insulted Parker family and Quanah, whatever. I might insult D. Kelly, but I would never insult Quanah Parker and the Parker family. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
With the Peace Circle, one of the ones that did the research, her father's full-blooded Indian, and she had, I think it was a Cherokee, come in and do the blessing of the statues. And then there was a guy with a Indian drum who was, I mean, everything was really, I thought, done.
Tastefully.
Yeah.
Respectfully.
Respectfully.
And but you think about it. Hang on. Think, just within our little room here, just our little family here, how would your parents, grandparents have reacted to putting up a statue to Major Ripley Arnold and inviting the Indians to come in and bless the soil? I don't think most of our parents, grandparents would have thought that was really made any sense, but yet we do it, and we do it for a reason. And we can debate, discuss, good reason, bad reason, whatever, but just think about that.
A lot of theater.
There is a lot of theater to it. When the mayor of Fort Worth and the representative invited the Comanche Nation, and Lance Tamakera was part of that, to come and bless the soil, it was this great reverent event. We all paused, and we all bowed our heads, and we all were very respectful while they did the thing. And I couldn't help but think that most of these people who were doing this, and again, I don't know Lance Tamakera personally, but most of them, until very, very recently, had never done any kind of a Comanche ritual ceremony and didn't know it because they were raised away from the traditional rituals. But when it becomes the in thing, or a politically correct thing, then they acquire this ability to do these ritual dances that probably hadn't been done in generations. And I'm just guessing. I'm just guessing. I don't know, but I do think it's interesting that your grandparents, great-grandparents, maybe even your parents would have thought that was just weird as heck to have them there blessing the soil around these things, including Major Ripley Arnold statue. Other questions? I had a question. Yes, ma'am.
I just had a comment. When these statues were being carved and everything, the direct descendants, or there were approvals on our statues here at the Peace Circle from, as close as we could get to that. So they said, yes, this is a representation of our tribe, of our family, and direct descendants. So when the time came and all these were dedicated, that day of everyone that was there, it was very peaceful, it was very respectful, it was honoring from Grapevine to the Indians and back and forth. And I mentioned that to the mayor, how the whole weekend was just really very respectful and very, honoring to the Indians. And our president of the Historical Society, Odell, said that, I believe it was the Apache Indian representative, came to her with tears in his eyes, and he said, no one has ever recognized my people like you have done. And so it was a really, it just felt really good. That whole weekend was just.
I wasn't here, but I'm sure it was, and please, I'm not bad-mouthing
Oh, I'm
the
not,
Peace
I'm not,
Circle.
no, I don't mean it that way. I'm just saying, this is what happened that day. One other comment too, the news media came to Bill Taylor, mayor, and said, that Sam Houston had slaves, and he told He told them, he said, that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the peace circle here, so. He said,
Everybody in American history you could afford them back in the day had a slave, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5.
right, they wanted to make.
I don't know how we deal with that or handle that, and I understand the resentment of people who are descended, but Lordy, anybody, if you're a white person, had enough money and lived in the South, or even if you lived up north, you could afford a slave, you had a slave. You might treat them good, you might treat them badly, but Lordy, that was just natural.
And there were a lot of black people, a bunch in South Carolina that owned
The Cherokee Indians, some of them owned slaves, so it wasn't just, so anyway, but one of the problems, one of the problems with Native American history, which is a similar problem to black history, is that there's very, very, very hardly any records because the people who were those people didn't read and write, didn't have archives, didn't have museums, didn't have historical collections. So the history of both African Americans and Native Americans is almost entirely oral history. And the problem with oral history is it passed down, to pass down, to pass down, to pass. The problem with oral history, you ever played the game telephone? And you start around the circle? What happens by the time it gets around the circle back to where it started? What happens to the story?
Distorted changes.
It ain't the same story. And so the problem with dealing with oral history is how has it changed over the generations? But think about you. Think about the history, your family history stories you heard growing up. How many of those do you remember word for word, percent for sentence, of just who aunt and uncle did, what they did, grandma and grandpa, where they moved, who they did, and all this kind of stuff? And how many of it is kind of a few details you remember, and you fill in the rest with kind of whatever. Kind of telling a joke. You remember the punchline, but you don't remember the joke, but you kind of make it up to get to the punchline. And so we create stories of our family histories because you can't remember it all. But you don't want to say, beats me, I don't know what they did or who they did. So oral history, that's a problem with Native American history. And so when you say this is accurate, it's accurate according to a certain oral tradition handed down. But there's other oral traditions for the same thing. Last thing, and I'll shut up and sit down so we can do other things. What I want you to do, I want you to all rush back here and buy books. If I talk you to sleep, you won't do that. But in one of my books I wrote back, there's a chapter on Quanah Park before I did this, a Fort Worth Characters book, came out years ago. And one of the men I talked to was a self-styled representative of the Comanche Nation of Oklahoma, Bill something or other. Bill is half German and half Comanche. But Bill is a self-appointed spokesman for the Comanche Nation. And I learned later that a lot of the Comanche can't stand him. Don't believe he knows anything, don't want him to be a spokesman, don't consider him anything. At the time I was saying, tell me what you know, what you've heard, all this kind of stuff. And then when the book manuscript got to the publisher, and again, he made the mistake of sending him a copy of the chapter, and he threatened to sue the publisher. He said, this is all wrong. Everything you said about Quanah is wrong. I said, well, I have my citations, newspapers and stories where I got my stuff. Where does your stuff come from? That mine is wrong. And he says, I swear, he says, I'm Comanche. And I was fed up at that point because he'd been chewing on my ass. And I said, no, Bill, you're half Comanche, so your story's half right. But that was the point being that all the Comanche don't necessarily speak with one language any more than all African Americans speak with one voice about all agreeing on whatever, any more than all of us white people all have the same agreement on how history happened and who did what and when. So with that note, we turn it back to whoever, and hopefully on the way out or whatever, you'll stop back there and visit the table. At least look, make me feel good by looking.